Welcome, everyone. We're going to give people a couple of minutes to gather before we get fully started. In the meantime, please feel free to note in the chat where you are from, just so we have a sense of who's with us, please.
Folks are saying chat.
We may have a
disabled.
disabled chat, but just hang on and hopefully we'll be able to solve that quickly for you.
I think we solved it.
There we are. We got someone from Missouri, someone from northern Wisconsin, Chicago. So we have the middle of the country well represented. Then we have someone from Liberty Lake, Washington. So we got the West Coast, which is great.
Hartford.
California.
I know my college roommate is supposed to be coming from Seattle. So there we go.
Even more Western representation. Happy to have you all here. We will go ahead and get started. My name is Adelle Banks, and I'm the projects editor and a national reporter at Religion News Service, filling in for my colleague, managing editor Roxanne Stone. Today's discussion is entitled "The American Church is Reorganizing. Now What?" We will be focusing on a new book to be released later this month, Reorganize Religion, by my RNS colleague, Bob Smietana. It is pending publication, and it has provided us with an opportunity to look into the questions that are swirling around the American church about the declines we've seen in attendance and membership, and where we should go from here. It's prompted people to wonder, is this a time for despair, or action, or hope? We want to thank the Religion News Foundation for sponsoring today's event, which is recorded, by the way. And we ask you to please feel free to use the Q&A box to send in your questions for consideration towards the end of our discussion. If you wish, your question can be asked anonymously. And we, of course, want to thank our panelists for joining us as well. They are, in alphabetical order, Bob Smietana, who is a veteran religion journalist and national reporter for RNS. His new book, Reorganize Religion, The Reshaping of the American Church and Why It Matters, will be released August 30th by Worthy Publishing, an imprint of the Hachette Book Group that publishes books related to faith. Scott Thumma is professor of sociology of religion and director of Hartford Institute for Religion Research at Hartford International University. He's known for his studies of megachurches and non-denominational churches and is the principal investigator for a 5-year Lilly Endowment grant studying the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on churches. Jemar Tisby is an author, speaker, and historian whose writings include the New York Times bestseller, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the Church's Complicity in Racism. He also is the co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast, which began 7 years ago. And Phil Vischer is a filmmaker, songwriter, and author best known for the popular kids series, Veggie Tales, and the Bible teaching series, What's in the Bible. He also is co-host of the Holy Post podcast. Now we will start with Bob, who will tell us a bit about why he wrote Reorganize Religion and some of the key ideas and trends that are in the pages of that book. Then I'll ask some questions. We'll have a discussion of all our panelists, and we plan to leave time near the end of our hour or so together with questions from our audience. So again, please use the Q&A section for that. Bob, please fill us in a bit about your deep dive into Reorganize Religion.
Well, hey, thanks for everyone for being here. So I started out writing a book, I think, about why people should care about organized religion in America. And I realized about maybe a little way through that, I couldn't tell people why they ought to care if I couldn't tell people why I care about this. So I'm going to start by telling a story. And I'm going to break a rule of religion reporting. We usually don't tell people what about our own experience, but I'm going to break that rule a little bit because I did in the book. So I want to take you back to the early 1990s. At that time, I was in my 20s, newly married. I had a job working on affordable housing in Chicago, which was my dream job. And I was going to seminary thinking that someday I might be a pastor, and everything was going just the way I planned. And then, as you probably guessed, everything fell apart. My wife and I started having problems, and we split up. The job was a nightmare, mostly because I had no idea what I was doing. And as you might guess, seminary was not for me. So I felt kind of lost and not sure where I was going to go. And about that time, I ended up at the doorstep of Grace Covenant Church, which is the church that's pictured behind me, which is a small congregation on the north side of Chicago. It was about to close actually a few years before I arrived, but they sent a new young pastor and he was starting to revitalize it. And the pastor happened to be a friend. He said, "Why don't you come to our church?" So for a few months, I've been sitting in the back row and pretending and hoping that no one would notice I was there. And of course, a woman named Jerry Klatt was having none of that. Jerry was an older woman. She and her husband, Fred, had been longtime members, and she wanted to make sure that everyone who showed up in the church knew that they were welcome. So she had been, we talked a few times. So I show up on an Easter Sunday, and I had, for once, put on a tie and dressed up, and I show up at church, and of course she's thrilled. She gives me a big hug, compliments me on my tie, and then she grabs my ponytail. At the time, I had very long hair, and says, "Now, if we could just do something about this, it would be awesome." But she was obviously thrilled to be there, and I felt seen and at home. So Kathy and I ended up, as you might guess, we ended up showing up there. We healed our marriage. We had kids. We made friends. It really changed the course of our lives. And that church was really activist community. So when a pastor who had been a political prisoner in Chile showed up with his congregation looking for a place to worship, the church welcomed them. When a group of Sudanese young men from a refugee camp came to Chicago and found that the church that was supposed to sponsor them had backed out at the last minute, our church welcomed them as well. And about a decade ago, they started something called Fed by Grace, which is a church food pantry led by volunteers from the church and the community that feeds families in the community. It's a very important part. So why did I tell you all this? Well, I tell you all that to tell you this. About a week ago, I got a letter from the church that read, "We regret to inform you that our congregation has decided to close." As you can guess, the years have not been great for churches, and Grace is not immune from some of the changes. So when I started as a religion reporter, the average church, according to Faith Communities Today, had about 137 people. Now there are 65, and a whole host of outside pressures, changing demographics, political polarization, the loss of faith in religious institutions, the decline in religiosity among young people, COVID, debates over sexuality had caused the church to decline, like many other churches. And many churches are like this in every community where they're located, right? Churches play an important role in the lives of their congregation. They play an important role in their communities, and people are wondering, is this sustainable? Are we going to be able to stick around? And one of the questions I asked in the book is, what's going to happen if that happens? Who's going to resettle the refugees? Who's going to be there when people show up in trouble and looking for a helping hand? Who's going to gather friends together? Who's going to run food pantries? Who's going to run shelters and all the kind of work that churches do? And of course, lots of secular groups do these things, but churches and other faith-based institutions play a huge role in this. There's one other thing I want to say, and then I'm going to let our kind of turn it over to everyone. One of the ideas I have in the book is this, well, actually two. One is that one of the problems for religion in America is this, that it's not that one thing is changing after another. It's that everything is changing all at the same time, and people don't know how to keep up. And one of the pastor of Grace Covenant, which is closing, I talked to her pastor the other day. She's like, we feel like failures, like we did something wrong because they just couldn't keep up with everything happening. The other thing is that three things I think happen in this moment of crisis. One is religious congregations and faith groups they just do what they're doing, and they kind of do it until they close and shut down. Second thing they do is adapt. They try new things. They try online worship. They try new faith communities. Some of these things work. Some of them, they try yoga. They try all kinds of different adaptations. The third thing they do is turn on each other. In a moment of crisis, they decide they're going to fight over race, over sexuality, over CRT, over politics, over all kinds of vote, whatever it is, they're going to find each other. And they do this while the house is burning down around them. And instead of using the values of their faith to build community and try something new, they turn on each other. And so I think those are some of the choices that people face in the book. Now, I mean, that doesn't sound very hopeful, but there are hopeful parts of this church, but there are real struggles because what people do now will affect people with generations to come. So this congregation, for example, started in the 1800s. And in 1940, their building burned down. So they built another one. And then when the church started to shrink, they merged with another church. And then they rebooted it. And they kept doing it. So people for generations have done things to create the institutions that have shaped many of our lives. And now they're in trouble. And what we do now, what church leaders do now, will affect people for generations to come. So that's a little bit about the book.
Thanks a lot, Bob. In the introduction of Bob's book, he talks about both Bible teacher Beth Moore and one-time Southern Baptist ethicist Russell Moore. These two prominent Christian leaders, who are not related, by the way, felt they had to leave behind the Southern Baptist denomination, a church group that one time they would have called their beloved spiritual home. I'd like to note how each of the other panelists relate to those two stories of the Moores and their Christian transition, either through your personal experience or through your research. Any of you can go first, Phil, Jemar, Scott in particular.
Well, I had a similar experience. There was an article in the New York Times by Campbell Robertson called A Quiet Exodus. And it was during the Trump administration, and he was looking at Black Christians quietly leaving their predominantly white, typically evangelical Christian spaces. I was in the Presbyterian Church in America and had a very similar experience of the particularly ideas around race being exposed in a more prominent way. And I had founded something called the Witness, a Black Christian collective. And so I was writing about race and speaking about race. We had all of these major incidents and tragedies around race, from the killing of Mike Brown to, as we record this, I believe it's the anniversary of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Of course, the polarization and the reaction and response to the Trump presidency and evangelical support of the president, all of that happening in addition to police brutality instances caught on cell phone video, all of that, it was in the old-fashioned sense of the word, apocalyptic, in terms of revelatory. It revealed a lot. And so we actually, on our podcast, Pass the Mic, did a series called Leave Loud. What happened was there were so many instances, particularly of Black Christians and other Christians of color in these predominantly white spaces, deciding, I cannot stay here anymore. It is not healthy for me to be here anymore. That we said, well, instead of a quiet exodus, we need to actually tell our stories. And do two things. One, give the opportunity for these organizations, institutions, and individuals to repent, to learn what they were doing, to see how they were harming folks. And then also as an act of liberation and dignity, to say we're not going to keep our pain to ourselves. We're going to share. This is part of our testimony. This is part of our witness. And so it has been a very revelatory period of years in these past few years.
Yeah, jumping in on that, I've done a lot of research on the as kind of thinker and trying to get up to speed. I've done a lot of research on the fundamentalist modernist controversy of the, started at about 1890 and went through about 1930, where the American church was just turned upside down by liberal theology from Germany, and everyone had to decide which side of this are you coming down on. So the church really split on a pole, on an axis of liberal to conservative theologically. But then we settled down and we kind of said, okay, you guys are still churches and we're still churches, and now let's do church just in our own lanes. And what's been wild to watch in the last, particularly since, 2015, is churches finding another axis to divide over that has nothing to do with theology. Neither of the Moores left the SBC. Well, they were kind of pushed out, but it wasn't about theology, other than whether, Beth should be in a pulpit on a Sunday morning with or without a title. But what they left, it was much more about culture wars. And so now we have two different axes. So we have four quadrants. You can be theologically conservative, but you can be labeled politically progressive. And that's pretty much just as bad as being theologically liberal. So you can be theologically and politically liberal. You can be theologically and politically conservative, or you can combine those things. And we're finding new ways to dislike each other. And that's really been the most upsetting thing, just watching myself as the creator of VeggieTales, and everybody loves VeggieTales. Surely he's a good guy. But people are calling my theology into question. And when I push, it has nothing to do with theology. It's because, I don't know, you had this guy, Jemar Tisby, on your podcast, and we heard about him. Do you know what we heard about him? So it's all this, it's guilt by association that has nothing to do with theology, but it's splitting the church on different axes that are just not sustainable, where we have this divide going on. And I have to find a church that's theologically conservative, but also politically conservative, and do I mean more libertarian, or do I mean more Ron DeSantis, or, what do I even mean there? So there's an idolatry of politics that has made it impossible for many of us who were fine worshiping together to continue worshiping together. Mm-hmm. And our kids find it preposterous. Can I just go out on a limb and say that the next generation finds it embarrassing that this is what we're fighting over, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. And that should be the biggest concern, is if we all look like we can't do church together because of politics, our kids find our theology powerless. And that's a really disturbing thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Phil. Scott?
Yeah, I'm gonna in some ways follow Bob's model and tell you a story about myself. No, I grew up in independent Baptist that Nancy Emmerman would call a little f fundamentalist, right? We were just good conservative Christians. But about the time I was in high school, our longtime pastor left, and I left the church at that time to go pursue other things. And a Liberty University pastor came in and made the church a big F fundamentalist. And that was probably the last time I was there, because it brought in all the Jerry Falwell kinds of issues and that sort of thing. But by that time, I was already exploring. I was born a sociologist of religion, so I was already exploring other faith traditions and moving around. But another 10, 15 years later, I was in Atlanta and found a wonderful Southern Baptist church, Oakhurst Baptist, and probably the best church I ever attended. And yet it was Southern Baptist, and I told myself I would never go to a Southern Baptist church. But we had gay deacons, we had women clergy, and not surprisingly, we were eventually thrown out of the Southern Baptist Convention. But I had already in some ways given up on churches. I saw the importance of congregations and the importance of that, but I was moving in a trajectory that I think maybe a lot of folks a little bit younger than I am, but also our generation that moved, and that is kind of more interested in spirituality and less interested in the organized religious life. But I'm this odd combination of also realizing what Bob mentioned early on, that the true importance of congregational life, both for society, but also for human beings and for social connectedness. And so consequently, my whole entire life has been studying congregations and not really devoted to really attending them personally. But that doesn't make me any less of a kind of spiritual person or any less committed to the vitality and the longevity of this organizational form. Congregations do an immense amount for society, and they're in a struggling place at this point.
Thank you. So I guess we've talked a bit about some of the challenges that are facing these congregations, but I'm wondering what makes it particularly hard for them to adapt to the changing culture, to all these things happening at once, as Bob mentioned. Does anybody have any way of looking at why it is so hard right now for them to adapt?
We're used to not having to change very quickly, because we all grew up the way church was done. It's amazing the number of people who say church should be the way it was when I was 10, whether they're 80 or 11. They're saying I like the way church was when I was, and there was this moment in time that we all remember, and church just doesn't change very quickly. So I think the pandemic in particular, our church ran into some big issues because we bumped into George Floyd issues right after, in the middle of the pandemic. So we weren't even all together to talk about it in person. So we're literally trying to have a town meeting for the congregation to discuss our response to George Floyd over Zoom, when part of the congregation has never used Zoom before. So it was this like perfect storm of, you can't be together. You're fighting over things you've never fought over before, and there was a mistrust growing because we were learning about each other's beliefs in ways. I mean, people have said that 2020 was apocalyptic in the true sense of the word, that it revealed things that we hadn't seen before. And, so people were looking at each other across the aisle and say, wait a minute, that's what you think about race in America? And it was in both directions. Wait a minute, you think America's bad? And we didn't have the tools to deal with that kind of conflict because in general, we just hadn't seen it before. So we weren't ready. And then to have all that hit in the middle of a pandemic when you couldn't even get together and give each other a hug, we were not ready for that.
There was one of the people I talked to for the book had this great analogy of the Hamlet problem for churches, which basically the church leaders and congregations have been trained to think that they're the star of the show, that if something happens, it's their fault. So if the church is growing, it's our fault, we did the great thing. If it's not growing, it's our fault, we're doing the wrong thing. And this sociologist used to be called into churches to say, should we fire our pastor? Which was generally like, are they doing a bad job? And if we just got someone else, and he would go and look at the community. And of course he'd say, well, you can fire your pastor, but it's not your decline is not related to them. It's related to the world around you and how it's changed, and that the world around you that you built yourself for isn't changed. And he said, you're really like a bit player in a play, and the play's going on, and you're going to have to adapt to all the things around you. And even if you've done everything right, that was going to happen. And all these changes are going to happen to you, and you're going to have to adapt. And congregations and church leaders are not used to that. They're used to being in charge, or they're used to finding a theological problem to it. So it used to be that there was a whole idea that conservative churches would grow and liberal congregations would shrink. Well, now they're all shrinking, right? They're all shrinking, especially if you're mostly white, you're shrinking. And if you're not diverse, you're shrinking because you can't escape the environment that you're in.
So I do think a lot is changing, but I think the levers, some are bigger than others. So in particular, as we look at churches sort of scrambling, dissolving, being ripped apart, whatever it might be, two issues seem to be a pattern. One, what do we believe about race in America, in the United States in particular? And two, what do we believe about truth? Now, the truth issue is related to the politics issue, but I think is a more fundamental issue than the politics. The politics is a manifestation, and the division within politics is a manifestation of one's epistemology, your approach to what it means to believe, and what is true and what is false, and how you determine that. The race issue is such an old issue within Christianity, right? In the United States, it goes all the way back to even before the founding of the political entity known as the United States. 1667, the Virginia Assembly is making a law that says baptism would not emancipate an enslaved African, Native American, or person of mixed race descent. That's 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, right? And then so much of the controversy arose in light of videos of a white police officer with his knee literally on the neck of a black man, and so many similar incidents that are too tragically numerous to name. So let's not skirt that issue, right? Like, there's still a deep reckoning within the church in the United States that has to happen around race and racism. The second thing is truth. Was the election stolen or not? Did or do masks help prevent the spread of a viral pathogen or not? Right? These are issues of truth. And there are so many people. So the last thing I'll say is, I really don't think it's helpful to think of a sort of false equivalencies of both sides, this, that, or the other. I read one article that said it's not polarization that's happening, it's radicalization that's happening. Which is to say, one side is not moving to its extreme nearly as fast or as far as another side. And because that side is radicalizing, it becomes impervious to facts, it becomes impervious to data, it becomes about ideology. And that is fundamentally unchristian, because we follow the way, the truth, and the life. We say the truth will set you free. And so we got to go back to basics and what do we believe about truth, as well as this reckoning on race.
Yeah, unfortunately, one of the challenges with that is that we've kind of raised a generation of, seeker-sensitive church attenders that have no experience of putting themselves under the authority of a pastor, so that a pastor is not actually in a position, I choose you, pastor, you don't choose me. So if you tell me my epistemology is wrong, I'm going to go to another church where the pastor tells me, so, we covered the story of a church, I forget where it is, that's grown 1,000% since things got crazy in the last 2 years, because the pastor started talking right-wing current events from the pulpit, and now they're building a new building, so we're rewarding pastors for reconfirming our beliefs that we walked in with, and punishing them for challenging our beliefs. And that makes it really hard to get up and say, I need to tell you that you're not actually following the truth on this issue, because half the people are going to say, hey, well, you're not my pastor.
Thanks for your responses, Scott. We'll let you start with the answer to the next question. So will we end up with church deserts, places where there are no local congregations or few options outside of the local megachurch?
No, I don't think so. To go back to the last question and tie the two together, I mean, if you look at the history of religion in the globe, most change comes from the outside. It comes from new prophets rising up and say, "You heard it said before, but I say to you." So I think that one of the problems is there has been a lack of church planting, a lack of the development of new models and new ideas coming from the outside, and we're starting to see now a real change of people innovating the old models of gathering and doing religious life together, and so I think the future holds, Adele. I mean, there will be the megachurches because in a sense, megachurches have become one of those models, right? But we're also seeing dinner churches. We're seeing third space kinds of churches. We're seeing all sorts of digital and virtual sort of realities. And so we don't know which of those models is really going to fit in the future. And because we have such a divided culture and all the subcultures, I think we're only going to see a plethora of different ways of being the church in society. And Phil, to go back to the idea of, I mean, I think capitalism and consumerism has really put the individual as the authority in society. And what that's going to mean is that congregations are going to have to rethink how they do nurturing and discipleship and right. You can't assume that the clergy can't assume that someone is going to be obedient to some other authority. They're going to have to be convinced of that. They're going to have to because and that's going to be the countercultural message, right? You're not in charge of your life if you're a Christian. You have to conform to another. But that is completely counter to our society. And so how are we going to reshape that message? Society changes, but so do these cultural ideals. And I think we haven't come to grips with the idea that everyone who walks in the door now is their own authority. And so our goal is not to get them to convert. Our goal is to get them to be disabused of that idea, or to embrace a higher idea than the self. That's tough. And early sociologists of religion predicted that was the direction we were going to go. We were going to be a cult of individuals, and we are that now.
So if we are a cult of individuals, go ahead, Bob.
No, ahead, Adele. You go ahead.
I just wonder whether anyone does, including you, Bob, think that we will end up with these church deserts because everyone's pretty much, it sounds like, almost their own church.
Yeah, I wonder if we might, because one thing I wonder is we might lose a lot of little congregations in places. I think about the town I live in, which has small congregations that are 50, 60 people. And so in the town, right down the street from me is this little Episcopal church that runs this mobile food pantry. They started during the COVID. They're all working on it together. They have in the church, they have like gas cards and $20 gift cards for anyone, someone could walk from down. You could walk there and show up and get some help. And a lot of congregations, you can get the kind of help. You can't get like the giant help that government services provide. You get the little help, like I don't have enough groceries. I need some gas money. I need to make my rent this month. That congregations can provide that little bit of help to keep your life from spiraling out of control. But because they're in communities, and if those close, they're not going to be replaced by new congregations. And starting new congregations is going to take a long time. The second thing I would say, to something Jemar said to me, struck me. I love Grace Covenant. It's played a big role in my life. I wondered, while we were there, we had a number of Hispanic folks there. We had Sudanese men who were Black. We had no African-American folks in our church. And I kept thinking, why do we have no people, why is our congregation, we have more people from Africa than African Americans in our community. It was a problem for us that we maybe didn't see at the time that we should have seen. The third thing is that at the same time, everyone's a congregation of one. We have these rules of leadership that are very top down, that are non-congregational. Let's say, I'm the authority. To be here, you must submit to my authority. And so we're putting all this leadership pressure on people, one, to be like sort of infallible, but to claim authority they don't have over people. So when people say, wait, I didn't think, so the church says to you, we love you forever. You're part of our congregation. Awesome. And then you say to the minister, hey, I think what we're doing is wrong. Oh, now you have challenged the authority and you're gone. And we don't have the kind of like models of congregational life where people can speak into the leadership of the church. Well, they speak with their feet, right? They leave, but they don't want to leave, because if you leave, the cost is your friends, your family, the place that calls home. They are such an integral part of people's lives that when that happens, they can lose everything. So either they don't say anything or they leave and they don't go anywhere.
Does anybody else have a thought about whether we're moving to church desert? So I'm just wondering what our neighborhoods are going to look like if all these people are leaving and under their own authority, as some of you have been saying.
Yeah.
What happens next?
We've had some people leave our church recently, but it's resulted in the creation of, a couple of home churches, as people don't want to lose community. They've just lost faith in a particular institutional presentation of community. And sometimes that's a good thing. Let's try it a different way. Let's strip down the traditions and find, it's just people gathering in living rooms, people gathering over dinner, people gathering in any way. It doesn't have to be, in a building where we dress up and show up at a certain time. So I don't know that there would ever be church deserts unless there are no Christians. If there are no followers of Jesus in a community, there will be no church. I think I'm separating the difference between church and churches, because we tend to think of as buildings and facilities, as opposed to there's a dinner party and it's 20 Christians and they're getting together and they enjoyed it so much they're going to do it every week. Oh, look, it's a church.
And yet the organized part of organized religion is so important, as Scott was saying earlier, right? Having a place to be. How do you because they give you like regular times to meet, a little bit of institutional framework to put your values, and like that dinner church is not starting a disaster relief ministry or a homeless shelter so the institutional church provides this thing. So one of the things that worries me is that it's disintegrating and we're not paying attention. We'll go like, wow, do these new things. And not to say that you're saying that, but like things are disintegrating. They're really important. So in the book, I talk about, we moved to a new house when we moved from Nashville to the small town outside Chicago, and the kitchen is too small. And what we really love to do is to knock out this wall between the living room and the kitchen. It'd be awesome. Our kitchen would be great. We'd have an open plan, but it's a bearing wall. And if we knock it out and we don't put anything there, the roof caves in. And so what I wonder is sometimes we are knocking out all these bearing walls and the roof's going to cave in because we're not thinking about how do we create institutions and communities and communities and the institutions to support them.
So I think a couple of things. One, I agree with Phil, like people are always going to look for community. And I think what's happened in the past 7-8 years in particular is a lot of folks have lost confidence in the institutional church or their particular congregation or denomination. By the way, there are bellwethers of this. This wasn't sudden, right? There are lots of people, particularly in marginalized groups, who realize this. And I think one of the things that prompts discussions like these is, quite frankly, more white Christians and more white evangelicals have experienced that disillusionment that's been happening in other communities for a very long time. So there's that dynamic, just to put that out there. The other factor is that churches, congregations are great for relief work. They're great for the person who wanders in and needs a gas card, needs a place to stay for the night, whatever it might be. Churches have not been all that effective in terms of transformational systemic change, not because there isn't a desire or goodwill, but because it's not an institution that's set up for that. That has to be done by larger structures like local, state, and federal bodies, right? So it could almost be that new wine and new wineskins, both in terms of the model of church that we do, which, by the way, I don't think we should start with the model. I think we should start with ministering.
Yeah.
Where are people hurting? How are people hurting? Which, in my view, is going to be a lot of churches leaning into lament. We've had a pandemic. We have lost loved ones. We have lost churches. We have lost relationships. We have lost jobs. All of these things related to the pandemic and beyond. We got to weep, y'all. What is the 21st century version of blues music in the church? We have to let it out and be cathartic in community with followers of our faith, right? Like, so that's just your bonus right there. What I'm saying is, in terms of social change, what's going to fill that gap? Well, honestly, it could be people of faith working in and among the institutions that actually can bring systemic change, right? And it might be catalyzing and equipping people of faith to work in those spheres, and not just on the relief end, but on the justice end, that makes it unnecessary, hopefully, for that person to wander in need of something just to survive the next day.
Sounds like
Jemar.
you're talking about partnerships and more than, I mean, not that their prayer is not going to happen, but partnerships in new ways. Is that part of the solution? Because I mean, that is the big question here, is what is the solution? What is next for the churches and congregations that are challenged by this, seeing people leave, closing their doors, et cetera?
Well, I mean, in some sense, Adele and Jemar, denominational structures have actually worked for justice and change in the system in some sense, but those are really networks of strong congregations and strong leaders, and that is in erosion too. We're talking at the congregational level, but as congregations go, so go their denominations, and what that then means is we have to create new networks of influence and structures that can put more pressure on the political party and those processes. It's I think inevitable that we're probably going to lose 30 or 40% of congregations in the next 20 years. But it's not going to be equal across the country. New England is vastly overchurched, and it's probably good to get rid of some of them. We don't need 2 copies of every mainline denomination in every city in New England, but they don't need them either because they're almost empty. But one of the things that gets lost there, I mean, a congregation, the average size congregation, as Bob mentioned, is 65 attendees. That half the congregations are that size or smaller in the country. A congregation that large can't do a whole lot. They can keep the lights on, they can keep a part-time pastor, but there's not much else there. But there's also space. And if you think about how many nonprofits, how many AA meetings, how many other groups use that space, if that congregation is gone and is turned into a restaurant or something, that is a larger effect in many ways than just that congregation disappearing, right? And I don't see space in society for those AA groups to meet and other, especially as the separation from church and state and secular and private increases. So it will be a loss, but in some sense, there's a pruning that absolutely needs to happen.
And Jemar was right. It's the one thing I try to make clear in the book, that like all the social capital that churches create doesn't replace a just society, doesn't replace transformation. And in some ways it could numb some of that, right? We put up with things. They do have a particular role in the kind of liminal space between where programs and people's lives start, because people's lives are always messy, but it can't replace all that. And sometimes there's this idea. Can I tell you my favorite story from the book? Because it's super hopeful.
And then we're going to move to Q&A questions. Yes, we want some hope here.
All right, let me give you two. So I have two really exciting ones, but this is the one I'll tell you. So in the town of Smyrna, Tennessee, there's this little Episcopal church. And it was a brand new church, and it was going like gangbusters. And it was a more conservative Episcopal church. Well, then the pastor of the church gets really mad at the presiding bishop of the Episcopal church, and because he doesn't like her, and they leave. They basically leave. Almost everybody leaves, and there's like 12 people left. And so this sounds like a bad story, right? We hear the story all the time. So then they send this young pastor in there. He's to close down the church, and just about after he arrives, these folks from Myanmar show up. They're all Anglicans. They're like, we need a place to worship. And he's like, we're closing down the church. They're like, well, we don't care. We still need a place to worship. And all of a sudden, all these people who are refugees and resettled from Myanmar show up. And now they've got a Myanmar, Burmese, Christian Episcopal church. It's not all self-supporting. They get some money from the diocese, but they really built this brand new congregation out of nothing. It showed up, and because people need a place to be. And the church at one point said, okay, well, this is what we thought it was going to be. And all these people are going to leave. It was going to be terrible, but this new thing started. I'll tell you one other thing real quick. The Mars Hill story is a wonderful story. So Mars Hill, when Mars Hill was declining in 2007, 2008, it's really great. There's two churches. There's Mars Hill, there's this church called Inner Bay Covenant Church. They're right across the channel from each other. They're both dying. Only one knows. And that is this Inner Bay church. Older church, pretty healthy, but they're like, we're not going to make it long term. They're renting church to a multi-ethnic congregation called Quest Church on their space. Pastor and the old pastor and young pastor become friends. The old church goes, we're going to die. We're going to give up everything. We're going to merge your church. You can have our building. We're going to give this up because we know we're going to collapse. And we would rather give this to you. They die, collapse. Mars Hill thinks they're all great, but they're already starting to implode. And in a few years, they implode, they disappear. So who buys the Mars Hill building? But this Quest Church, led by an Asian American woman. So the first woman to preach in the Mars Hill space, where it was kind of hyper masculinity and only men can talk, and this kind of mega church, everything, is this Asian American woman named Gail Song Bantam, or Bantam Song. I probably got it wrong. But they become that church because this old church said, no, we're going to. So there are new things, if people will say, and they're really wonderful, and they're sometimes unexpected, but there's pain that goes through it. But sometimes you just think, this is all going to die and fall apart and go. But it takes a kind of awareness that, wait, the old thing we did is gone and it's never coming back. And we could either say that we are going to close because we can't have what we want, or you can say, oh, we could have this new thing, which might be pretty awesome.
Thank you, Bob.
So my hope for the day.
We got to move on to what our audience members might want to ask. I thank you all for this great discussion so far. It's really important, and it's really hard to squeeze it into supposedly an hour's time.
Yes.
So the first question we have is, what role do you believe seminaries can have in response to the reorganization of religion in America, both to serve the needs of the clergy and the laity?
Well, one of the problems we've had and have talked about quite a bit is that seminaries teach pastors how to preach, but not how to pastor. And when you're getting into issues of abuse, when you're getting into issues of race, when you're getting into the issues of, not everything lives or dies based on how well you exegete. So there's the human touch of listening and sharing and protecting and weeping. And I think seminaries, we've talked about this a lot at our church, seminaries need to rise up and provide more than just, this is how you prepare a sermon. Because that's not what's driving people away from church. It's not, that sermon was a 6, and if it had been an 8, I would have stayed. It's, I was abused, or there was abuse of power, or there was spiritual abuse. The pastor froze up like a deer in the headlights and had no idea what to do, so they did nothing, and I'm gone. And not only that, I'm not sure if I still believe what I believed, so people are losing their faith, not because of bad preaching, but because of bad pastoring. And that's something the seminaries really need to think more thoroughly about.
Jemar, Scott, do you have a comment about the role of seminaries and all we're speaking about?
Sitting in a seminary.
Yeah.
But we're the exception to the rule. Seminaries change less frequently than do churches. And in part, it's because of tenure. It's because of the structure gets created centuries before. It's almost impossible to innovate in a seminary. Ours is different. My seminary has 40% Muslim students, and we've just changed our name, and we bring new programs and everything in all the time, but that is not the typical seminary. and the more successful a seminary is, the less likely it seems to innovate. So but Phil is absolutely right. There are so many things that need to be corrected. I mean, how many seminaries teach a course on Zoom worship or on creating digital disciples and those sorts of things? There is, however, I'm tied in with the Association for Theological Schools and their research, and there's a whole initiative among seminaries to add new and innovative programs, but I don't think they're coming fast enough. And the vast majority of seminary professors are schooled and in their lanes, and they're not gonna dissolve those lanes to create something new. So it's a real challenge. I think the hope is to train up clergy in church plants and in established congregations that are doing it right, that are innovative, and spawn out disciples that way. In some ways, the way Vineyard started, the way Calvary Chapel started, right? They didn't start sending out those pastors to seminaries and then go plant the church. They trained them in an innovative structure and then sent them out to churches. And I think that's the future of good clergy in the country.
Thank you. I'm going to let Jemar answer this next question first. I am an ELCA Lutheran interested in trying to establish better relationships with Latino persons. I live in a town of 60,000 in the middle of the country, was predominantly white until 20 years ago, now 60% white, 40% from Mexico and Central America. What books, podcasts, etc., would help us discover our prejudices and abilities to reach out to our new neighbors?
Well, the good thing is that we live in the information age, so there's no lack of resources. The problem is almost sifting through them. I would, for this particular situation, recommend Robert Chow Romero's book, Brown Church, where he talks about 400 years of identity, theology, and justice in I think it's particularly Mexican church, more broadly Latina churches. So that's there. I would also begin very, very granularly and local. Talk to the people there. talk to the folks in the community who are just moving in or who may not be part of your church yet. Where are they? Where in terms of the concerns they have, the challenges they're facing? And that's going to lead you to different resources, because you may end up needing to do research on housing development or basic income, whatever it might be. And it's all very particular. So I'm hesitant to just sort of lay out blanket. I would encourage everyone to learn history, learn the history of the community, find out where folks are coming from, why they're coming there, but begin with the people where you are.
Anybody else want to add to that question related to just dealing with a changing neighborhood, a changing community, and still wanting to know how to reach people, knowing what to read to reach people? If not, we'll move on to the next question. There was a question about seminaries that focuses on clergy. And then there's also a question that relates to laity, which should be almost our last question. Please reflect on the quote unquote priesthood of the laity, end quote, that all churches talk about and few live in. Can the lay people keep the church alive?
That implies the
say
clergy
yes.
are, yeah, the clergy are not keeping the church alive. It is the laity that are keeping the church alive. Yeah.
But this notion of authority that we're discussing makes you think that sometimes there's a question about that, you know, the clergy may think they're the authority figures, even as the laity believe they are too.
I think there are different types of authority. You know, you can look at someone for preaching authority, teaching authority. That doesn't mean, you know, they're telling you when you're ready to get married and who your spouse should be.
Yeah.
So we get into all sorts of screwy views of authority, you know, in ecclesiology, and that's something to think about. But yeah, we're all in the priesthood of believers, so we should listen to everyone, but it also can't be chaos and anarchy, like a potluck run amok and turned into a food fight.
Potluck run, that sounds
The
fun.
potlucks run amok, not at these new dinner churches that we've been talking about today. It's an interesting phrase.
I was thinking, sorry.
Go ahead, Bob.
I was thinking something about Jemar said, that lay people can do something, and pastors too, is just listen a lot more and lament and hear people, because we are trained in something they call affective polarization, that we may not disagree with people on substance, but we agree to figure out to identify people, what group they belong to, where they fit along that axis Phil was talking before, and why I should dislike them. Instead of saying, oh, wait, you might be right, I might have done something wrong, which is the whole part of, at least in the Christian tradition, it's like, what is the first step, right? I've messed up, I'm sinful, I'm imperfect. And we have all these practices and teaching about listening and being imperfect and realizing and examining yourself. And lay people can do that too. You can say, wait, how do I want to act? And am I acting in accord with our teachings? Not just sort of like the behavioral teachings or like policy or theology, but like as a human being. Am I being a human being? Am I acting out and living these things out? And if I'm not, then maybe that's something wrong there. And maybe we have all these resources we could draw on. They're rich resources. This is not the first time that congregations have had crises and turmoil and change. And there's a lot to learn from. There's a professor named Nicole Flores. She's at, I think, the University of Virginia. She's in Charlottesville, but she studies, when we had that question before, she studies Hispanic congregations in Denver, and she's done some really, really interesting work. I wanted to mention her name.
Thank you. So I am afraid that we are running out of time, but I did want to give Bob the chance to tell us how he intends to celebrate the publication of his book.
So my daughter is a cake decorator by trade, and she's going to make a cake with the book cover, and we're going to be able to eat my words, which is going to be wonderful. And I'm so thrilled that everyone was here. So thrilled that y'all pushed me and pushed the ideas in the book and what your insights. Several of you, Jemar and Scott, are in the book. Sky Jazani, who works with Phil at the Holy Post, is there. Can I say one more thing? One thing that's really interesting about congregations is that they often exist for the benefit of others. So I'm telling you about my mom. Take 2 minutes. It'll be quick. So organized religion and churches changed my mother's life in ways I did not realize till I started writing this book. My mom is a daughter of immigrants. Her parents are Portuguese and French Canadian, and they were very poor. Their neighborhood is the neighborhood where you built the highway over it. So their house is actually underneath an on-ramp. And they didn't have enough room. Their grandmother lived with them. So my mom shared a bed with her grandmother till she got married. And she gets, this is in the 50s, she graduates high school, and there's no money for her to go to college. And she's a really bright student. She can't go anywhere. So she's going to get a job as a mill worker, like her mom, in the Fall River knitting mills. At the time, textiles were real big in New Bedford, Mass, where they were growing up. Those mills are all gone. Really would have been the end. It would have been a closed door for her. Except the guidance counselor says, there's this hospital in town called St. Luke's, which has a nursing school, and they got a scholarship and you would qualify. My mom didn't want to be a nurse, but she became a nurse. And this scholarship opens up a door for her life to be something different. Well, here's the great part about this. I thought it was a Catholic hospital. It's an Episcopal hospital, started by an Episcopal Sunday school in the 1800s. Now, 1800 Episcopalians in the 1800s were not really excited about Catholics. They were not going, I want to build a hospital and a school that's going to help young Catholic immigrants get ahead in life. But they build it and they grow it. And all of a sudden, this institution, which is for the benefit of others, changes my mother's life. And we're all downstream from the choices that people made decades ago. Often they didn't know us, but they thought this is the right thing to do. Let's do the right thing and see what happens. And there's a real opportunity right now for people to say, let's do the right thing. Let's try some things, not because we're going to benefit, but because other people will benefit and our communities will benefit. And if they do, that's a really good thing. It's not just about my benefit and my thing, but I could make something that changes other people's lives in ways I'd never expected. So that's my sermon at the end of the book.
I will have to say, as reporters, I know Bob and I would both welcome hearing what choices people make to see what happens and what's going to happen in the way of innovation, because Religion News Service, I'm sure, will want to write about that and keep informing you beyond this 1 hour session that we so appreciate your having joined us for. Thank you so much to the panelists. Please check the chat before we depart for a link to more information about Bob's book, Reorganized Religion. There also will probably be a link somehow for you to take a quiz so that you can figure out how much organized religion affects you, not just if you're in the pew, but just wherever you are. Also, anybody who registered for this event will receive a link to the recording, and it will also be available on Religion News Service's YouTube channel. So thank you again, one and all, panelists, audience. We very much appreciate your being here today. Take care, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Great.